Gagawin Gagawin sana nilang isang papuri sa lupa ang pangalan ng kanilang manlilikha at sasagutin ang layunin kung saan binigyan sila ng buhay, ngunit nabigo silang gawin ito. Mayroon maraming higante, mga lalaking may mataas na tangkad at lakas, kilala rin sa karunungan, bihasa sa pag-iisip ng pinakatuso at kamanghamanghang mga gawa. Ang kanilang pagkakasala in giving loose rein sa kasamaan ay according sa kanilang mental ability. God bestowed upon these antediluvians many and rich gifts, but they used his bounties to glorify themselves and return them into a curse by fixing their affections upon the gifts instead of the giver. They employed the gold and silver, the precious stones, and the choice wood in the construction of habitation for themselves, and endeavored to excel on another in beautifying their dwellings with the most skillful workmanship. They sought only to gratify the desires of their own proud hearts, and reveled in scenes of pleasure and wickedness, not desiring to retain God in their knowledge. They soon came to deny his existence. They adored nature in place of the God of nature. They glorified human genius, worshipped the works of their own hands, and taught their children to bow down to graven images.
It says, pinagkalooban ng Diyos ang mga tao ng mayayamang regalo, ngunit ginamit nila ito sa pansariling interes. Ginamit nila ang mga ginto, pilak, ang mamahaling bato at ang piniling kahoy para makapagtayo ng tahanan para sa kanilang sarili. Ngunit hindi ito ang nais ng Diyos, at hindi nagtagal nitanggi nila ang kanyang pag-iral, kaya sinamba nila ang kalikasan. Mga larawang inanyuan at ito ay kanilang niyukuran.
In the green fields and under the shadow of the goodly trees, they set up the altars of their idols, extensive groves that retained their foliage throughout the year, were dedicated to the worship of false gods. With these groves were connected beautiful gardens, their long, winding avenues, overhung with fruit-bearing trees of all descriptions, adorned with statuary, and furnished with all the good delight the senses or minister to the voluptuous desires of the people, and thus allure them to participate in the idolatrous worship.
Itinayo nila sa ilalim ng mga magagandang puno ang kanilang mga altar ng kanilang Diyos-Diyosa. Sa malawak na kakahuyan, naiipon ang mga dahon sa buong taon at ito ay inaalay sa pagsamba sa mga huwad nilang Diyos. Sa kakahuyan na ito, konektado ang mga magagandang hardin, mga pinaganda at pinalamutian upang maakit at sila ay maglingkod sa masasamang pagnanasa ng mga tao.
Men put God out of their knowledge and worship the creatures of their own imagination. And as a result, they became more and more debased. The psalmist describes the effect produced upon the worshipper by the adoration of idols. He says, "They that make them are like unto them. So is everyone that trusteth in them." It is a law of the human mind that by beholding we become changed. Man will rise no higher than his conceptions of truth purity, and holiness. If the mind is never exalted above the level of humanity, if it is not uplifted by faith to contemplate infinite wisdom and love, the man will be constantly sinking lower and lower. The worshippers of false gods clothe their of their deities with human attributes and passions, and thus their standard of character was degraded to the likeness of sinful humanity. They were defiled in consequence. God saw that the wickedness of a man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. God has given man his commandments as a rule of life, but his law was transgressed, and every conceivable sin was the result. The wicked the wickedness of men was open and daring. Justice was trampled in the dust, and the cries of the oppressed reached unto heaven. So, sinasabi ko dito na ah pag pinatuloy mo po yung pagsasamba mo sa mga false gods, ah tayo po ay, that man will be constantly sinking lower and lower. So, polygamy had been early introduced, contrary to the divine arrangement at the beginning. The Lord gave Adam one wife, showing his order in that respect. But after the fall, men chose to follow their own sinful desires. And as the result, crime and wretchedness rapidly increased. Neither the marriage relation nor the rights of property were respected. Whoever coveted with the wives or the possessions of the neighbor took them by force, and men exulted in their deeds of violence. They delighted in destroying the life of animals, and the use of flesh for food rendered them still more cruel and bloodthirsty, until they came to regard human life with astonishing indifference. The world was in its infancy, yet iniquity had become so deep and widespread that God could no longer bear with it. And he said, I will destroy man whom I created from the face of the earth. He declared that his spirit should not always strive with the guilty race. If they did not cease to pollute with their sins the world and its rich treasures, he would blot them from his creation and would destroy the things with which he had delighted to bless them. He would sweep away the beasts of the field and the vegetation which furnished such an abundant supply of food, and would transform the fair earth into one vast scene of desolation and ruin. Amid the prevailing corruption, Methuselah, Noah, and many others labored to keep alive the knowledge of the true God and to stay the tide of moral evil. 120 years before the flood, the Lord by a holy angel declared to Noah his purpose and directed him to build an ark. While building the ark, he was to preach that God would bring a flood of water upon the earth to destroy the wicked. Those who would believe the message and would prepare for that event by repentance and reformation should find pardon and be saved. Enoch had repeated to his children what God had shown him in regard to the flood, And Methuselah and his sons who lived to hear the preaching of Noah assisted in building an ark. So God preached na may mangyayari na flood, kaya those who would believe the message and would uh, prepare para sa mangyaring flood should find pardon and be saved. God gave Noah the exact dimensions of the ark and explicit directions in regard to its construction in every particular. Human wisdom, human wisdom could not have devised a structure of so great strength and durability. God was the designer, and Noah the master builder. It was constructed like a hull of a ship, that, that it might float upon the water. But in some respects, it more nearly resembled a house. It was stories high, with but one door, which was in the side. The light was admitted at the top, and the different apartments were so arranged that all were lighted. The material employed in the construction of the ark was the cypress or gopher wood, which would be untouched by decay for 100 years. The building of this immense structure was a slow and laborious process on account of the great size of the trees and the den of to rent and the great size of the trees and nature of the wood. Much more labor was required then than now to prepare timber, even with the greater strength that men then possessed. All that man could do was done to render the work perfect. Yet the ark could not of itself have withstood the storm which was to come upon the earth. God alone could preserve his servants upon the tempestuous water. So, nung nabuo nila yung arka, God was the designer and Noah the master builder. It it was constructed like a hull of a ship that it might float upon the water. It was 3 stories high. So, sobrang taas po pala. But with one door, and which was in the side.
By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. While Noah was giving his warning message to the world, his works testified of his sincerity. It was thus that his faith was perfect and made evident. He gave the world an example of believing just what God says. All that he possessed, he invested in the ark. As he began to construct that immense immense boat on dry ground, mul- multitudes came from every direction to see the strange sight and to hear the earnest, fervent words of the singular preacher. Every blow struck upon the ark was a witness to the people. Many at first appeared to receive the warning, yet they did not turn to God with true repentance. They were unwilling to renounce their sins. During the during the time that elapsed before the coming of the flood, their faith was tested, and they failed to endure the trial. Overcome by the prevailing unbelief, they finally joined their former associate in rejecting the solemn message. Some were deeply convicted and would have heeded the words of warning. But there were so many to jest and ridicule that they partook of the same spirit, resisted the invitations of mercy, and were soon among the boldest and most defiant scoffers. For none are so reckless and go to such lengths in sin as do those who have once had light, but have resisted the convicting Spirit of God.
Uh, Many at first appeared to receive the warning. Halos lahat o ah, halos lahat na-receive yung warning na may dadating na flood. Yet, they did not turn to God with true repentance. So, hindi pa rin sila, hindi sila naniwala. Uh, they did not turn to God with true repentance and they were unwilling to renounce their sins.
The men of that generation were not all, in the fullest acceptation of the term, idolaters. Many profess to be worshippers of God. They claim that their idols were representations of the deity. And the truth and that through them the people could obtain a clearer conception of the divine being. This class were foremost in rejecting the preaching of Noah, as they endeavored to represent God by material objects. Their minds were blinded to his majesty and power. They ceased to realize the holiness of his character or the sacred and unchanging nature of his requirements. As sin became general, it appeared less and less sinful, and they finally declared that the divine law was no longer in force, that it was contrary to the character of God to pu- punish trans punish transgression, and they denied that his judgments were to be visited upon the earth. Had the man had the man of that generation obeyed the divine law, they would they would have recognized the voice of God and the warning of his servant, but their minds had become so blinded by rejection of light that they really believed Noah's message to be a delusion.
So, yung mga tao talaga, hindi talaga sila naniniwala kay Noah. Their minds had become so blinded by rejection of light that that they really believed in Noah's message to be a delusion. So, si Noah hindi nagkulang para ipaalam sa mga sangkatauhan na uh, sinabi ng Panginoong Diyos na may mangyayaring uh, flood at sinunod ito ni Noah wholeheartedly. Sinunod ni Noah yung utos ng Panginoon gumawa ng art at bigyan ng warning yung mga sangkatauhan. Ngunit may mga tao talagang ayaw makinig sa kanya, pinagtatawanan na lang siya, hindi siya pinaniniwalaan. So, ayun. It was not multitudes or majorities that were on the side of right. The world was arrayed against God, God's justice and his laws. And Noah was regarded as a fanatic. Satan, when tempting Eve to disobey God, said to her, "Ye shall not surely die." Great men, worldly, honored, and wise men repeated the same. The threatenings of it and the punishment of the being he has created. Uh, the threatenings of God, they said, are for the purpose of intimidating and will never be verified. You need not be alarmed. Such an event as the destruction of the world by the God who made it, and the punishment of the beings he has created, will never take place. Be at peace. Fear not. Noah is a wild fanatic. The world made merry at the folly of the deluded old men, instead of humbling the heart before God. They continued their disobedience and wickedness, the same as thought God had not spoken to them through his servant. But Noah stood like a rock amid the tempest. So, may may paninindigan talaga si Noah. Like, uh, stood like a rock amid the tempest. Surrounded by popular contempt and ridicule, he distinguished he distinguished himself by his holy integrity and unwavering faithfulness. A power attended his words, for it was the voice of God to man through his servant. Connection with God made him strong in the strength of infinite power, while for 120 years his solemn voice fell upon the ears of that generation in regard to events, which, so far as human wisdom could judge, were impossible. So, kahit naman may mga taong hindi naniniwala kay Noah at pinagsasabihan pa siya ng kahit ano-ano, pinalakas talaga siya ng Panginoon. Connection with God made him strong in the strength of infinite power. The world before the flood reasoned that for centuries the laws of nature had been fixed. The recurring seasons had come in their order. Heretofore, rain had never fallen. The earth had been watered by a mist or dew. The rivers had never yet passed their boundaries, but had burned their water safely to the sea. Fixed decrees had kept the water from overflowing their banks. But these reasoners did not recognize the hand of him who had stayed the waters, saying, "Hitherto shalt thou come, but no further." As time passed on, with no apparent change in nature, men whose heart had at times trembled with fear began to be reassured. They reasoned, as men reason now, that nature is above the God of nature, and that her laws are so firmly established that God himself could not change them, reasoning that if the message of Noah were correct, nature would be turned out of her course. They made that message, in the minds of the world, a delusion, a grand deception. They manifested their contempt for the warning of God by doing just as they had done before the warning was given. They continued their festivities and their gluttonous feast. They ate and drank, planted, planted and builded, laying their plans in reference to advantages they hoped to gain in the future. and they went to greater lengths in wickedness, and in defiant disregarded of God's requirements to testify that they had no fear of the Infinite One. They asserted that if there were any truth in Noah had said, the men of renown, the wise, the prudent, the great men would understand the matter. Had the antediluvians believed the warning and repented of their evil deeds, the Lord would have turned aside his wrath, as he afterward did as he afterward did from Nineveh, but by their obstinate resistance to the reproofs of conscience and the warning of God's prophet, the generation filled up the measure of their iniquity and became ripe for destruction. The period of their probation was about to expire. Noah had faithfully followed the instruction which he had received from God. The ark was finished in every part as the Lord had directed, and was stored with food for a man and beast. And now the servants of God made his last solemn appeal to the people with an agony of desire that words cannot express. He entreated them to seek a refuge while it might be found. Again, they rejected his words, and raised their voices in jest and scoffing. Suddenly a silence fell upon the mocking throng. Beasts of every description, the fiercest as well as the most gentle, were seen coming from mountain and forest and quietly making their way toward the ark. A noise of a rushing wind was heard, and lo, birds were flocking from all directions, their numbers darkening the heavens, and in perfect order they passed to the ark. Animals obeyed the command of God, while men were disobedient, guided by holy angels. They went into unto Noah into the ark, and which they could not fathom, but men had become so hardened by their persistent rejection of light that even this scene produced I am sorry, and the clean beast by sevens. The world looked in wonder, some in fear. Philosophers were called upon to account for the singular occurrence. But in vain, it was a mystery which they could not fathom. But men had become so hardened by their persistent rejection of light that even this scene produced but a momentary impression, as the doomed race beheld the sun shining in its glory, and the earth clad in almost Eden beauty. They banished their rising fears by boisterous merriment, and by their deeds of violence they seemed to invite upon themselves and visitation of the already awakened wrath of God. So, uh, and and now the servant of God was made his last solemn appeal to the people. Nagsimula ng pumasok yung mga animals, lahat ng mga any kind of animals pumasok na sa arka, beast of every description, the fiercest as well as the most gentle. Pero yung mga tao, hindi talaga sila nakinig. Uh, God commanded Noah, "Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I sinned righteous before me in this generation." Noah's warning had been rejected by the world, but his influence and example resulted in blessings to his family as a reward for his faithfulness and integrity. God saved all the members of his family with him. What encouragement to parental fidelity.
Mercy had ceased its pleadings for the guilty race. The beasts of the field and the birds of the air had entered the place of refuge. Noah and his household were within the ark, and the Lord shouted him in. A flash of dazzling light was seen, and a cloud of glory more vivid than the lightning descended from heaven and hovered before the entrance of the ark. The massive door, which it was impossible for those within to close, was slowly swung to its place by unseen hands. Noah was shouting, and the rejectors of God's mercy were shout out. The seal of heaven was on that door. God had shut it, and God alone could open it. So when Christ shall cease his intercession for guilty men before his coming in the clouds of heaven, the door of mercy will be shut. Then divine grace will no longer restrain the wicked, and Satan will have full control of those who have rejected mercy. They will endeavor to destroy God's people, but as Noah was shut into the ark, so the righteous will be shielded by divine power. So, so ang Diyos lang talaga makakapagbukas ng pinto ng arka, and siya din ang makakapagsira. And there is nga na mga tao na hindi wala sa loob ng arka ay ang Satan na ang bahala. For 7 days after Noah and his family entered the ark, there appeared no sign of the coming storm. During this period, their faith was tested. It was a time of triumph to the world without. The apparent delay confirmed them in the belief that Noah's message was a delusion and that the flood would never come. Notwithstanding the solemn scenes which they had witnessed, the beasts and birds entering the ark, and the angel of God closing the door, they still continued their sport and revelry, even making a jest of the signal manifestations of God's power. They gathered in crowds about the ark, deriding its inmates with a daring violence which they had never ventured upon before. But upon the 8th day dark clouds overspread the heavens, there followed the muttering of thunder and the flash of lightning. Soon large drops of rain began to fall. The world had never witnessed anything like this, and the hearts of men were struck with fear. All were secretly inquiring, can it be that Noah was in the right and that the world is doomed to destruction? Darker and darker grew the heavens, and faster came the falling rain. The beasts were roaming about in the wildest terror, and their discordant cries seemed to one out their own destiny and the fate of man. Then the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Water appeared to come from the clouds. It mighty cataracts. Rivers broke away from their boundaries and overflowed the valleys. Jets of water burst from the earth with indescribable force, throwing massive rocks hundreds of feet into the air, and these, and falling, buried themselves deep in the ground. in the ground. The people first beheld the destruction of the works of their own hands, their splendid buildings and the beautiful gardens and groves where they had placed their idols were destroyed by lightning from heaven, and the ruins were scattered far and wide. The altars on which human sacrifices had been offered were turned down, and the worshippers were made to tremble at the power of the living God, and to know that it was their corruption and idolatry which had called down their destruction. As the violence of the storm increased, trees, buildings, rocks, and the earth were hurled in every direction. The terror of man and beast was beyond description. Above the roar of the tempest was heard the wailing of a people that had despised the authority of God, Satan himself, who was compelled to remain in the midst of the warning elements, feared for his own existence. He had delight to control so powerful a race, and desired them to live to practice their abominations and continue their rebellion against the ruler of heaven. He now uttered imprecations against God, charging him with injustice and cruelty. Many of people, like Satan, blaspheme God, and had they been able, they would have turned him from the throne of power. Others were frantic with fear, stretching their hands toward the ark and pleading for admittance. But their entreaties were in vain. Conscience was at last arose to know that there is a God who ruleth in the heavens. They called upon himself earnestly, but his ear was not open to their cry in the in their cry. In the terrible hour they saw that the transgression of God's law had caused their ruin. Yet while through fear of punishment they acknowledged their sin, they felt no true contrition, no abhorrence of evil. They would have returned to their defiance of heaven, had the judgment been removed. So when God's judgment shall upon the earth before it's deluged by fire, the impenitent will know just where and what their sin is, the despising of his holy law. Yet they will have no more true repentance than did the old world sinners. Some in their desperation endeavored to break into the ark, but the firm-made structure withstood their efforts. Some clung to the ark until they were borne away by the surging waters, or their hold was broken by collision with rocks and trees. The massive ark trembled in every fiber as it was beaten by the merciless winds and flung from bellow to bellow. The cries of the beast within expressed their fear and pain, but amid the warning elements it continued to ride safely. Angels that excel in strength were commissioned to preserve it. The beast, exposed to the tempest, rushed toward man and stood expecting help from him. Some of the people bound their children and themselves upon powerful animals, knowing that these were tenacious of life and would climb to the highest points to escape the rising waters. Some fastened themselves to lofty trees on the summit of hills or mountains, but the trees were uprooted and with their burden of living beings were hurled into the seething billows. One spot after another that promised safety was abandoned. As the waters rose higher and higher, the people fled or refuged to the loftiest mountains of Tin Man, and these would struggle together for a foothold until both were swept away.
So, parang naubos na po tayo ng oras. Pasensya na po kasi hindi po namin ma-summarize. Pero to summarize our topic po, it's about God's it's about po sa mga utos ng Diyos na sinunod ni Noah sinunod po ni Noah wholeheartedly at naniwala po siya sa Panginoon. Kahit po anong sabihin ng mga tao, it applies to us din po na kapag naniniwala din tayo sa Panginoon, kahit anong bad comments ng mga tao sa paligid natin, basta may Panginoon po tayo na pinaniniwalaan natin, wala na talaga tayong hindi na natin papansinin po sila dahil po sa tulong ng Panginoon, mapapalakas po ng Panginoon yung kalooban natin katulad ng experience po ni Noah na grabe din po kasi hindi talaga siya pinaniwalaan ng tao pero dahil po sa kapangyarihan ng Panginoon, pinalakas niya po si Noah. At yun po yung the flood.
Thank you. So, any reflection from the
Yung takog ba ba?
reflection? The young people? Jujime, can you give the reflection?
Okay po. So for our reading this afternoon po, all about the flood in Prophets and Kings, written by Sister Ellen White. My reflection po is, while Sister Erla was reading the text, the words of God, nag-reflect sa akin yung kung gaano yung ano ba yung tawag dong anti-type po sa panahon ni Noah at sa panahon natin ngayon. Kasi si Noah was given a purpose or given a task for this special work, this certain work na kung saan na kung saan kailangan niyang i-accomplish itong special work na ito na ibinigay sa kanya ng Panginoon. So Noah, 'di ba? Noah preached many years. He was a great preacher. Kasi nga yung even though hindi siya nakadala hindi niya nadala yung ibang tao, yung hindi niya nadala yung ibang tao, pero nadala niya yung pamilya niya. That's why he was called a great preacher. And then also po, we can relate this to us as a follower of God, as a present truth believer. Kasi 'di ba, we are given as a special and certain work that talagang malaki yung responsibility natin kasi hindi basta-basta tong responsibility natin kasi it is a heavenly work. It is a heavenly work. And also po just like the experiences of Noah, he was criticized. Uh, uh, he was called names because kasi nga yung sa gumawa siya ng arka sa tuktok pa ng bundok. That's why he was criticized, called many names. And the same, it is still the same sa panahon natin ngayon. While we are experiencing things like we are criticized inside the mother church, while we are sighing and crying for the abomination inside the church. That's why we can really relate to the experiences of Noah. And ang may term ang term ata nito is antitype, type, and antitype po. Sa panahon ni Noah at sa panahon natin ngayon. So, that is my reflection po na yung pag-preach ni Noah is kasi nga ang sanlibutan talaga ay nasakop ng kasamaan. That's why God uses the flood para ma wash away na yung mga kasalanan ng mundo. And then God uses Noah as an instrument to preach his word na mayroong dadating na flood in the day na pipiliin ng Panginoon. Mayroong dadating na flood para i-sift yung mundo natin kasi nga polluted na siya sa kasamaan. And same with our time in the last days na we are used as an instrument to sigh and cry, to share the message to our brothers and sisters in the mother church in order para mabigyan sila ng warning. And the warning na, and also because we love our brothers and sisters, we love our brethren, we will do our task, our responsibilities with pleasure po. And then yun nga po, may ano talaga tipo and type and anti-type siya. Yun lang po yung reflection ko sa reading na to po ngayong afternoon. Thank you.
Hello po, Kuya. May gusto lang din po akong i-add. Pwede po ba?
Go ahead, Jen.
So, meron po akong na-reflect. There are, I've reflected a maganda talaga na lesson po. First is on how God is very specific to His commandments, diba? So, even nga sa size ng ark, He has a specific command. So, that really symbolizes, so God is asking of us a perfection, diba? So, and next is that we have heard, diba, na God gave many opportunities for man to change. First, nag-preach si Noah sa kanila, and then they've been given a chance, diba? So to be saved, but if yung tao talaga yung ayaw, God will judge them like what happened to the flood. So there are many people din na nagregret sa kanilang mga ginawa, but it was already too late. So that's what I reflect. There is just God is giving us opportunity to change, but He cannot. There's always a time. The time will always come for judgment. So that's what I've reflected po.
The Galibon family, especially Sean, Tagalubon, or Joko Liputan. Okay. So reminders lang next time, kung ano lang siguro summarize nyo ang ganyan. Just do the summary of the chapter. Then, pasok-pasok ko kung hindi mo mong PowerPoint. So, Tagalog, especially as playing, swimming around, in.
Yes po, kuya.
Ako tayo pa-comment si Sunshine, natin Sunshine, o
Ang totoo, kuya. Nagsasaba man
comment
ni.
sa reading sa kuwan. Naman sa ating pastor. So, ibalay sa rin sa comment sa flat ba?
Okay. Ako, kuya. Ako ang nagbasa si sister, sister itong nagbasa ka ganina. Nagbasa si sister ka ganina, na ano na ko na ang naka-hit ako pag ayo is katong ay nabay dili ka sa bato bisa din. Okay lang Bisaya.
Yeah, okay lang yan. Puro raman wala may Tagalog diri karon. Puro ra mga Bisaya ang nag-attend.
Katong part nga kato bitong gi-abuse kayo nila ang life sa sa mga animals to the point na wala naabot sa punto nga wala na sila respect sa human life. Kato nga ano ba kato nga passage. Grabe kayo ang effect sa pag-violate kung mag-violate ta sa kanang sa kung unsay mga balaod dito nga nag-evolve around life kay dili lang sa kabalo naman ta sa principles ana nga kanang kung mag-consume ta og meat makataghan sa og impact, negative impact sa atong panglawas, but beyond that mag iyang ang pag-consume ana kay lagi what we eat is what we are. So kung ang ato ang ginakaon is kining sama anang dili makiniya ba nga animalism. So mag-lead sa ato ang nga wala na tayo respect sa life, even sa life sa kaning mga animals to the point na naabot sa even human life. Dili na nato i-regard nga kining holy. And, as you can see sa ato ang panahon karon dili kaan sa kanang sa gigaingon ni Sister Georgie kaganina, it's type and antitype kung unsa nahitabo sa una mao pod ang sa nagakahitabo sa tuwa karon is miniature na to sa una just karon is ang kanang mas lapad nga application sa ato karon. So kung kato nga panghitabo naka-cause nga ang Ginoo nakahukom sa nga tagaan og hukom ang kalibutan. We have to prepare ourselves kay ang yun nga katong sama sa kaadlawan no nagakahitabo na jud karon. So let us pray for one another na ang mga kamaturan nga atong nabatnan magapamunga jud dinhi sa ato. Wala siguro.
Sa pagbasa sa whole chapter, naman nakita ang Jurassic. Kung pagkaroon yung mga Jurassic. Ang mga Jurassic, wala ko sulit dito sa Arga. Yung pagbasa na, nakita ang peace people nga kayo. Saan yung mga chapter ito ay disco tayo ito ng peace mo powerful. Hindi mo itong Jurassic na wala ko sulit. Yung Diyos mo ito sila ng mga animals. Mahal pa nimo ang mga tidur dyan, bright mas kayo. Kaya lang, kasi kasi Pagkakaan mo din mas bright kasi lagi after time. Isa mga bright ka lang gusto mo. Sa taon na yun. Wala na mga bright kasi madaw ang lahat. Hindi ko ng mga intention. Hindi ako ayun na. Iba lang. Susunod lang. Pero kung yun na kayo, tapos mag-video. Kaya lang ano mas ganito. Mag-video ang mga animals.
Ano sa?
Animals na video lang. Kasi lagi ko naman ito, di ba? Ito, mga kuya, wala ba? Pero wala. Okay, more time na siguro natin. So next time, mga young people, isa, the whole chapter, babasa, one month. Only notice the let's end our closing prayer. See to do the closing prayer, please. Okay. Salamat sa contribution. Salamat for joining. Okay, please do the closing prayer, please. Juko na lang, pwede mangis. Juko. Juko.
Okay, wala mo po sa prayer. So let's pray every Great God, we will content you. Thank you so much, Lord, for this Sunday in which we have come and talk more about Jesus. Since we know the condition of the birth is as a plan, so that when the trials and the patience come into our life, this can bring us more closer to you, and this can make us more firmly anchored. Thank you, Lord, for everything. Please forgive us all for the sins we've done, thoughts, words, language, and language. This is us in the love of Jesus. Amen. Okay, salamat sa tanan. Salamat sa tanan. Thank you, Junilyn, Linlin, Tagalogan family, Shine, and Inging, KK, Joko, Joji. Thank you so much, Joji.
Thank you po. Hapon.
Hapon sa tanan. Ati, Kisane, Ati Mercy, salamat kayo. God bless. G, thank you kay G. Mag-out na niya.
Okay po. Thank you po. Ingat.
God bless. Tanan.
God bless.